Imagine a sword so massive that lifting it off the ground could disqualify you from battle. Yet in the right hands, it could cleave through 3 men in a single swing. These weren't just weapons. They were tests of human capability, forged at the very edge of what metal and muscle could achieve together. But the world of two-handed swords holds far more than oversized blades swung by brutish warriors. Hidden in the armories of fallen empires and the burial mounds of legendary fighters lie weapons so perfectly engineered that modern metallurgists still can't fully replicate their construction. Swords that were considered too dangerous for common soldiers. Blades that required a decade of training just to wield without injuring yourself. Steel so precisely balanced that despite weighing as much as a small child, masters could spin them faster than the eye could follow. Today, we'll uncover 5 of the most devastating two-handed swords ever forged, each one more lethal than the last. And the first on our list was so fearsome, entire military tactics had to be invented just to counter it. Sword 1. The Zweihänder, the Landsknecht's giant. Our journey begins in the blood-soaked fields of 16th century Europe, where a weapon emerged that would redefine what it meant to wield a sword. The Zweihänder. In German, it literally means two-hander. But that simple name belies a weapon of terrifying complexity. Picture this, it's 1515, somewhere in the Holy Roman Empire. Pike formations dominate European warfare, thousands of soldiers packed together, each holding a 15-foot spear, creating an impenetrable forest of steel. Cavalry can't break through. Infantry can't get close. It's a stalemate, until a new breed of warrior steps onto the battlefield. The Doppelsoldner. Double pay men. They earned twice the salary of regular soldiers, and when you see their weapon, you'll understand why. The Zweihänder they carried stretched between 5 and 7 feet long, some nearly as tall as a grown man. The blade alone could measure 4 to 5 feet, with some examples tipping the scales at 7 pounds or more. But here's what makes this weapon truly ingenious. It wasn't just about size. Now, you might think a sword this large would be clumsy, slow, unwieldy. That's exactly what their enemies thought, right before they died. The Zweihänder featured a ricasso, an unsharpened section of blade near the hilt, often wrapped in leather. This allowed the wielder to grip the sword partway up the blade for greater control, essentially turning it into a short spear when needed. But that's just the beginning of its deadly versatility. The weapon's crossguard extended into long, curved quillons that could catch and redirect enemy pikes. Some Zweihänders even featured side rings or a silt, a small shield-like projection, that provided additional hand protection and leverage points for complex maneuvers. But here's the part that sounds impossible. These 7-foot monsters could be swung fast. Devastatingly fast. The secret lay in their balance. Master swordsmiths spent months perfecting the weight distribution, ensuring the center of balance sat just a few inches above the crossguard. In the hands of a trained Doppelsoldner, the Zweihänder became a spinning cyclone of steel, the blade tracing figure eights through the air in continuous, flowing motions called flowing cuts. And their job on the battlefield? They were pike breakers. These warriors would charge directly into enemy pike formations, a suicidal task for anyone else, and begin hacking. The Zweihänder's weight and length gave them the reach to strike pike shafts before the points could reach them. A single well-placed blow could shatter a wooden pike shaft, or better yet, cut through multiple shafts in one sweep. Historical accounts describe Doppelsoldners clearing paths through pike walls like farmers scything wheat. One swing could disable 3 or 4 pikes, creating gaps in the formation that their fellow soldiers could exploit. But wielding one came at a cost that went beyond the physical. Training to use a Zweihänder effectively took years. The weapon demanded not just raw strength, but extraordinary coordination, stamina, and tactical awareness. Swing too hard and the blade's momentum could throw you off balance, leaving you exposed. Swing too softly and you'd bounce harmlessly off enemy weapons. The wielder had to read the battlefield constantly, identifying threats, calculating angles, managing distance, all while swinging a 7-pound blade through defensive patterns. The physical toll was immense. Contemporary accounts describe Doppelsoldners as being notably larger and more muscular than average soldiers, but even they could only fight for short, intense bursts before exhaustion set in. Their arms, shoulders, back, and core all worked in constant coordination. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, and that massive blade could twist in your grip, dislocating a shoulder or worse. And there was another cost: fear. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of your own weapon. The Zweihänder was so dangerous to its wielder that accidents were common during training. Historical records document numerous cases of trainees severely injuring themselves, slashing their own legs during overhead swings, losing control during spins and striking fellow soldiers, or simply dropping the weapon on their own feet. Some training schools required students to practice with wooden replicas for up to a year before touching actual steel. Yet despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, the Zweihänder became a symbol of ultimate martial prowess. To master it was to join an elite brotherhood of warriors who had conquered not just their enemies, but the weapon itself. But here's something that will surprise you. The Zweihänder's reign was relatively short. By the mid-1600s, gunpowder weapons had evolved to the point where pike formations themselves were becoming obsolete. As tactics changed, the Zweihänder's specialized role vanished. These magnificent weapons were melted down by the thousands, their steel recycled into more practical tools of war. Today, surviving Zweihänders are exceptionally rare. Most examples in museums are ceremonial pieces, parade weapons that never saw battle. The true combat Zweihänders, the ones that carved through pike formations and changed the course of battles, have almost entirely disappeared from history. But the legacy remains. Modern historical European martial arts practitioners have reconstructed the fighting techniques through careful study of period manuals. And when you watch a skilled practitioner wield a properly balanced Zweihänder, you understand why these weapons inspired such fear and respect. Yet as formidable as the Zweihänder was, it pales in comparison to our next sword, a weapon so revered that its very name became synonymous with the warrior class of an entire nation. Sword 2. The Odachi, Japan's field sword. We now travel east, to feudal Japan, where samurai culture elevated sword-making to a spiritual art form. But among their arsenal, one blade stood apart, so large it was never meant to be worn at the hip. The Odachi, the great sword. Some called it the Nadachi, or field sword, because it could only be drawn in the open battlefield. Here's what makes this weapon extraordinary. While European greatswords were designed to break through armor and pike formations, the Odachi was engineered with an entirely different philosophy, one rooted in the unique metallurgy and combat traditions of Japan. Imagine a blade stretching over 6 feet in total length, with the sword edge alone measuring 4 feet or more. Some legendary examples allegedly reached 8 feet, though surviving examples of such size remain unverified. Unlike the Zweihänder's relatively straight profile, the Odachi featured the classic Japanese curve, a sweeping arc that transformed each swing into a drawing cut, a technique that maximized the blade's cutting power. But here's what's fascinating. Despite its massive size, an Odachi typically weighed less than a Zweihänder. This wasn't a design flaw, it was intentional genius. Japanese swordsmithing had evolved along a completely different path than European bladesmithing. Rather than creating uniformly hard steel, Japanese swordsmiths developed a technique of folding and layering different grades of steel, creating a blade with a hard, sharp edge supported by a flexible, shock-absorbing spine. This meant they could create longer blades without proportionally increasing weight. The result? A 6-foot sword that weighed perhaps 5 to 6 pounds, still incredibly heavy by Japanese sword standards, but remarkably light for its size. But that lightness came with a trade-off, and it's one that reveals the true nature of the Odachi's purpose. The weapon couldn't withstand the kind of brutal, repeated impacts that a Zweihänder endured. Slam an Odachi against armor or another heavy blade repeatedly, and the carefully layered steel structure could fail, causing the blade to chip, bend, or even shatter. This vulnerability shaped everything about how the weapon was used. Odachi warriors, typically mounted samurai or elite foot soldiers, employed a fighting style based on devastating first strikes. The weapon's length gave them superior reach advantage, and its curved blade concentrated force into cutting motions rather than chopping impacts. Against unarmored or lightly armored opponents, which was common in Japanese warfare, a skilled wielder could cut through flesh, bone, and even thin wooden shields in a single stroke. Historical accounts describe Odachi-wielding warriors as battlefield specialists, deployed against specific targets rather than general combat troops. Their primary role? Breaking enemy charges and cutting down fleeing soldiers. Picture the chaos of a feudal Japanese battlefield. Armies clashing, formations breaking, soldiers rooting. This is where the Odachi excelled. A mounted samurai with an Odachi could pursue fleeing enemies, the blade's reach allowing them to strike from horseback without getting close enough for desperate counterattacks. A single rider could cut down dozens of running soldiers, turning retreat into massacre. But there was another, darker purpose for these massive blades. The Odachi became a psychological weapon, a symbol of status and supernatural prowess. Some were so large they could only be carried by attendants and presented to the warrior before battle. Drawing such a weapon was itself a statement. I am skilled enough, strong enough, and blessed enough by the gods to wield this. Legends grew around famous Odachi. Some were said to be inhabited by kami, divine spirits. Others were purportedly forged from meteoritic iron or quenched in supernatural waters. Whether these legends held truth didn't matter. The belief itself made these weapons more fearsome. But here's a detail that reveals just how challenging these weapons were. Many surviving Odachi show evidence of having been shortened. That's right, swords so impressive that they were displayed in temples and castles were later cut down to more manageable sizes because their original length made them simply too impractical. Some were converted into regular katana or tachi, their majestic length reduced to suit later owners who either lacked the skill or the specific battlefield role that justified such an enormous blade. The physical demands of the Odachi were unique among Japanese weapons. Traditional Japanese swordsmanship emphasizes whole-body movement, using hip rotation and footwork to generate cutting power rather than relying purely on arm strength. This principle becomes even more critical with an Odachi. A wielder had to develop extraordinary core stability, leg strength, and timing to execute effective cuts without being thrown off balance. Training manuals from the period describe specific exercises, cutting thick bamboo or straw bundles while maintaining perfect form, practicing draws from various positions, since the standard quick-draw Iaijutsu was impossible with such length, and developing the stamina to make repeated full-power cuts. Masters recommended that students train with the Odachi after mastering conventional swords, as attempting to learn with such an extreme weapon could ingrain bad habits that would be difficult to correct. And there was the spiritual dimension. Samurai believed that a warrior's spirit resided in their sword. With an Odachi, that belief intensified. These weren't mere tools, they were extensions of the warrior's soul, physical manifestations of their dedication to the martial path. Some warriors would spend months selecting the perfect Odachi, consulting swordsmiths, priests, and fellow samurai before committing to a blade that might be carried for a lifetime. But as with the Zweihänder, changing warfare eventually made the Odachi obsolete. The introduction of firearms to Japan in the 1540s began shifting battlefield tactics. By the late 1500s, organized formations of arquebusiers had proven more effective than individual sword-wielding heroes, no matter how skilled. The Odachi's role as a psychological and tactical weapon diminished. By the peaceful Edo period, when samurai became more administrators than warriors, maintaining the skills needed to wield an Odachi became a luxury few could justify. Today, authentic battlefield Odachi are among the rarest of Japanese swords. Most surviving examples are ceremonial offerings housed in shrines, too sacred to handle. The few combat Odachi that exist outside Japan are considered national treasures, each with documented lineages tracing back centuries. Yet the weapon's legend persists in Japanese culture. Anime, manga, and video games regularly feature impossibly large swords wielded by superhuman warriors, a direct descendant of the Odachi mythology. The weapon represents an ideal, the warrior who has transcended normal human limitations through discipline, strength, and spiritual refinement. But if you think the Odachi represented the pinnacle of oversized swordcraft, our next weapon will challenge that assumption, because we're about to encounter a blade that wasn't just large, it was engineered for a purpose so specific and so brutal that its very existence seems almost sadistic. Sword 3, the Scottish Claymore, the Highland Terror. We return now to Europe, but to a land of mists and mountains where warfare took on a particularly savage character. Scotland. And the weapon that emerged from its clans would become legendary for both its effectiveness and its intimidating presence. The Claymore, from the Gaelic Claidheamore, meaning great sword. But before we continue, I want to ask you for something. If you're enjoying these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing, it's free. Now, here's what's crucial to understand. When most people think of the Claymore, they picture the basket-hilt broadsword of the 17th and 18th centuries. But we're talking about the true greatsword Claymore, the two-handed weapon wielded by Highland warriors from the 15th and 16th centuries, a beast of an entirely different nature. These swords typically measured between 4.5 to 5.5 feet in total length, making them slightly smaller than Zweihänders but no less formidable. What they lacked in length, they made up for in brutal functionality. The blade itself featured a distinctive profile, relatively broad, double-edged, and coming to a spatulate point, wider at the tip than you'd expect. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. That broader tip concentrated more weight forward, turning each swing into a devastatingly powerful blow. But the most distinctive feature sits at the crossguard. Unlike the elaborate quillons of the Zweihänder or the minimal guards of the Odachi, the Claymore featured downward-sloping arms that terminated in distinctive catapult shapes, four-lobed designs that looked almost like flowers made of steel. These weren't merely decorative. The angled guards directed enemy blades away from the wielder's hands while providing solid catches that could trap or deflect weapons during close combat. And close combat was where the claymore truly earned its fearsome reputation. Highland warfare was intimate and vicious. Unlike the formal pike formations of European lowlands or the mounted samurai charges of Japan, Scottish clan battles often devolved into chaotic melees where men fought in close quarters across rough, uneven terrain. Hills, forests, marshes, the Scottish landscape didn't favor neat formations or cavalry charges. The claymore was designed for this reality. Its weight, typically around 6 pounds, was distributed to maximize chopping power in those wild swings that characterized Highland fighting style. A skilled Highlander would charge into battle wielding the claymore in broad, sweeping arcs, the blade building tremendous momentum. Here's what that meant in practice. These weapons could cleave through the limited armor most clan warriors wore. Leather jerkins, padded jackets, even mail, none offered reliable protection against a full-force claymore swing. Contemporary accounts describe wounds of horrifying severity. Limbs severed, skulls split, torsos opened from shoulder to hip. But wielding a claymore required more than strength. It demanded a particular kind of reckless courage. See, the Highland fighting style with these great swords was fundamentally aggressive. There was limited emphasis on defense, on careful positioning, on the kind of technical fencing you'd see with lighter weapons. Instead, claymore technique focused on overwhelming offense, getting inside your opponent's guard, delivering devastating blows before they could react, using the weapon's weight and your own momentum to simply overpower resistance. This approach had a psychological component. Imagine facing a charging Highlander, likely half-naked or wearing only a shirt, screaming Gaelic war cries, swinging a 5-foot blade in wild arcs above his head. The sheer audacity of the attack, the apparent disregard for personal safety, was as much a weapon as the steel itself. English and Lowland soldiers facing Highland charges reported being paralyzed by the sight, unable to mount effective defense against warriors who seemed possessed by battle fury. This wasn't mindless berserker rage, though, it was calculated aggression, designed to break enemy morale before the physical combat even began. But here's a detail that reveals the true nature of claymore warfare. Many surviving examples show significant damage, deep nicks in the blade, bent crossguards, even crude repairs made in the field. These weren't ceremonial weapons or symbols of status. They were working tools of war, used hard and often, passed down through families and modified as needed. A claymore might serve a family for generations, accumulating battle scars like a warrior's own body, each mark telling a story of violence survived. The physical demands of claymore fighting were immense but different from the technical demands of the Zweihänder or Odachi. Highland training emphasized endurance and explosive power over refined technique. Young men would train by cutting through thick tree branches, swinging the blades for extended periods to build the specific muscles used in combat, and practicing on uneven ground while running, simulating the chaos of actual battle conditions. There's a reason Highlanders were renowned for their physique. The lifestyle demanded it. Harsh climate, rough terrain, limited resources, and constant low-level warfare created men who were naturally conditioned for the demands of wielding these heavy weapons. Adding formal training to that foundation produced warriors of exceptional capability. But the claymore had limitations that shaped how it could be used. Its broad blade and forward-weighted balance made it slower to recover between strikes compared to lighter weapons. A missed swing left the wielder vulnerable, if only for a moment. Against an opponent with a shield and shorter weapon who could weather the initial assault, a claymore warrior might find themselves in trouble. This is why Highlanders often carried a smaller secondary weapon, a dirk or even a pistol, for close-in fighting if the greatsword failed. The weapon also required open space. In confined areas, inside buildings, narrow passes, dense forests, the claymore's length became a liability. Historical accounts of clan battles describe warriors abandoning their great swords for shorter weapons when fighting moved into confined spaces, then retrieving them when the battle opened up again. And there was the issue of armor. Against heavily armored opponents, fully armored knights or professional soldiers in quality plate, the claymore was less effective. Its cutting-focused design couldn't reliably penetrate good armor, and the broad blade could glance off curved surfaces. This contributed to the Highlanders' reputation for avoiding pitched battles against well-equipped English armies, preferring ambushes and raids where armor was less prevalent. Despite these limitations, the claymore became deeply embedded in Scottish identity. Even as warfare evolved and the weapon became obsolete, it remained a symbol of Highland warrior culture, of resistance against English domination, of a way of life that valued courage and clan loyalty above all else. The British government understood this symbolism. After the final defeat of the Highland clans at Culloden in 1746, laws were passed not just forbidding the bearing of arms but specifically targeting Highland culture, including the carrying of claymores. Possessing one became an act of rebellion, a connection to a forbidden past. Today, authentic combat claymores are rare and valuable. Many were destroyed during the post-Culloden suppressions. Others were buried or hidden, lost to time and elements. The surviving examples in museums represent only a fraction of what once existed, each one a tangible link to a martial tradition that defined a nation. But if the claymore represented the raw, aggressive spirit of Highland warfare, our next weapon embodied something different, calculated, precise lethality combined with engineering sophistication that seems almost modern in its approach to solving the problems of armored combat. Sword 4, the Italian Spadone, the master's weapon. From the rugged highlands of Scotland, we move to the Italian Renaissance, a time when warfare was becoming increasingly sophisticated and the art of swordsmanship was being codified into formal schools. Here, in the fencing halls of Venice, Bologna, and Rome, masters developed a two-handed weapon that represented the pinnacle of European sword design. The Spadone. In Italian, simply big sword, but that humble name conceals a weapon of remarkable refinement. At first glance, the Spadone resembles its German cousin, the Zweihänder. Understandable, both weapons emerged from similar tactical needs and roughly the same time period. But look closer, and the differences reveal themselves, differences that speak to divergent philosophies about the nature of combat. The Spadone typically measured between 5 and 6 feet in total length, slightly more compact than the largest Zweihänders. But here's what's fascinating. Italian weapon masters weren't simply making a smaller version of an existing weapon. They were redesigning the entire concept from first principles, applying the same mathematical and artistic principles that were revolutionizing Renaissance art and architecture. The blade profile shows this refinement immediately. Rather than the somewhat uniform width of the Zweihänder, the Spadone features a carefully calculated taper from base to point, the geometry precisely calculated to balance cutting power with thrusting capability. The cross-section isn't a simple diamond or hexagon, but a complex geometry that maximized structural strength while minimizing weight. And weight distribution? Here's where Italian engineering genius shows through. The Spadone's balance point typically sits closer to the hilt than comparable weapons, usually about 4 to 6 inches above the crossguard. This might sound like a subtle difference, but it transforms the weapon's handling characteristics. With more weight concentrated in the hilt area, the blade feels lighter in motion, responds more quickly to directional changes, and requires less muscle force to control. But the real innovation lies in the hilt design. Italian weapon masters understood that controlling a 6-foot blade required more than just 2 hands on a straight grip. The Spadone often featured side rings, crossbars, and even complex swept guards that created multiple grip points. A fighter could grip the weapon in standard position for powerful cuts, move one hand to the ricasso for close-quarters work, or even adjust grip dynamically during a fight to optimize leverage for different techniques. This flexibility of grip enabled the Spadone to serve multiple roles on the battlefield. It could function as a pike breaker like the Zweihänder, sweeping aside enemy polearms. But it could also engage in more refined swordplay, delivering precise thrusts or transitioning smoothly between attack and defense. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Spadone was one of the first weapons to have its techniques systematically documented. Italian fencing masters of the 15th and 16th centuries wrote detailed treatises on Spadone technique, complete with illustrations showing positions, guards, and techniques. These weren't just military manuals, they were sophisticated technical texts that analyzed the weapon with almost scientific rigor. Masters like Achille Marozzo and Angelo Vigiani described complex footwork patterns, binding techniques where the blade would control an opponent's weapon, and sequential combinations of cuts and thrusts. The Spadone wasn't meant to be swung wildly like a club. It was a precision instrument in the hands of a trained master. Training with the Spadone reflected this sophistication. Students spent years mastering the basic guards, positions with names like Guardia di Testa, Guard of the Head, and Porta di Ferro, Iron Door, before progressing to dynamic techniques. Unlike the Highland approach of building explosive power, Italian training emphasized economy of motion, using leverage and timing rather than pure strength. But don't mistake refinement for weakness. In the hands of a master, the Spadone was devastatingly effective. Historical accounts from Italian wars of the period describe Spadone-wielding warriors as elite troops, often serving as bodyguards for commanders or as specialists deployed at critical moments. Their ability to engage multiple opponents simultaneously, using the blade's length to control space and the complex guards to defend multiple angles, made them force multipliers in chaotic melee combat. Here's a detail that showcases the weapon's versatility. Contemporary illustrations show Spadone techniques against virtually every weapon type of the period. Defense against pikes, engagement with other greatswords, counters against sword and shield combinations, even techniques for fighting multiple opponents or protecting a third party. The weapon system was comprehensive in a way few others were. But with this sophistication came significant requirements. A competent Spadone fighter needed years of training under a master, regular practice to maintain skills, and the financial means to afford both training and a quality weapon. This limited Spadone mastery to professional soldiers, wealthy mercenaries, and members of fighting schools. It was never a weapon of common soldiers or militia. The physical conditioning required was also specific and demanding. Italian masters recognized that different martial skills required different physical attributes. Spadone training emphasized flexibility, coordination, and sustained moderate exertion over explosive power. Practitioners needed strong cores and legs to maintain the constant footwork, but also supple shoulders and wrists to execute the flowing blade movements. Contemporary training regimens included exercises that seem modern in conception, controlled cutting drills to build muscle memory, partner drills to develop timing and distance judgment, and even early forms of strength training using weighted implements. But here's something that might surprise you. Despite its effectiveness and sophisticated technique, the Spadone had a relatively brief period of military relevance. By the early 1600s, the same gunpowder revolution that obsoleted other greatswords was making pike and shot tactics dominant. Professional armies increasingly relied on coordinated firepower and disciplined pike formations, with less room for individual weapon specialists. The Spadone transitioned from battlefield weapon to training tool, used in fencing schools to teach principles of leverage, timing, and blade control that could then be applied to more practical weapons like the rapier or sidesword. Ironically, this transition ensured the Spadone's techniques survived better than many other great sword traditions. Because it remained part of formal fencing curricula for decades after its military obsolescence, the detailed treatises and teaching lineages were preserved. Today, historical European martial artists can reconstruct Spadone technique with greater accuracy than almost any other Renaissance weapon. Surviving Spadones show the quality of Italian craftsmanship. Many feature elaborate decoration, engraved blades, ornate guards, gilded furniture, suggesting they were as much symbols of martial mastery as functional weapons. Some bear makers' marks of famous smiths, while others show evidence of custom fitting to specific users, with grips sized to individual hands and balance adjusted to personal preference. But as sophisticated as the Spadone was, as refined and deadly in skilled hands, there's one final weapon we must discuss. A blade so extreme in its design, so uncompromising in its purpose, that it makes everything we've seen so far seem almost conventional by comparison. Sword 5. The Chinese Zhanmadao, the horse-cutting sword. Our final destination takes us to medieval China, to a period of constant warfare between competing kingdoms and nomadic invasions from the steppes. Here, Chinese military engineers faced a specific problem. How do you stop mounted cavalry when your infantry is outnumbered and outmaneuvered? Their answer was the Zhanmadao, literally translated, horse-cutting saber. Yes, you read that correctly. This weapon was specifically designed to cut down horses. The Zhanmadao represents perhaps the most specialized and extreme expression of two-handed sword design in history. Where other great swords evolved from existing weapons or adapted to changing battlefield conditions, the Zhanmadao was purpose-built from the ground up to solve a single tactical problem: how to bring down a mounted warrior in one strike. Let's start with the blade itself, because this is where the weapon's brutal purpose becomes clear. The Zhanmadao featured a single-edged blade that typically measured between 5 and 6 feet in length, comparable to other great swords. But the blade geometry was radically different. Instead of tapering to a point, the blade maintained significant width almost to the tip, with a pronounced curve that made European and even Japanese curved blades look subtle by comparison. This extreme curve served a specific purpose. When you swing a deeply curved blade in an arc, the effective cutting edge becomes longer. The geometry creates a slicing action rather than a pure chop. Against a charging horse's legs, this design concentrated tremendous force into a drawing cut that could sever muscle, tendon, and even bone. The blade's thickness was also remarkable. Unlike Japanese blades with their subtle tapering cross-sections, or European blades with their complex geometries, the Zhanmadao blade was almost uniformly thick, sometimes 3/8 of an inch or more throughout most of its length. This mass was necessary to deliver the sheer cutting power needed to disable a half-ton animal with a single stroke. But here's what makes this weapon truly fearsome: the edge geometry. Chinese swordmakers ground the Zhanmadao's edge to a relatively obtuse angle compared to cutting swords designed for human targets. This might seem counterintuitive. Wouldn't a sharper edge cut better? But against large animals with thick hides and massive bones, That obtuse edge was less likely to chip or roll, more likely to maintain its cutting ability through multiple strikes. The Zhanmadao was designed to remain functional even after cutting through multiple horses in a single battle. The hilt design reflected the weapon's specialized purpose. Rather than the complex guards of European greatswords or the minimal furniture of Japanese blades, the Zhanmadao featured a relatively simple but robust hilt, often wrapped in leather or cord for secure grip. Some examples included a modest disc guard, while others had minimal hand protection, the assumption being that users would be striking from defensive positions rather than engaging in close-range swordplay. And the way this weapon was used? It's simultaneously brilliant and horrifying. Historical Chinese military treatises describe Zhanmadao units as defensive specialists deployed against cavalry charges. The users wouldn't stand in open ground swinging these massive blades. Instead, they'd take positions behind obstacles, barriers, ditches, stake lines, anything that would force cavalry to slow down or funnel into narrow approaches. As mounted warriors approached, Zhanmadao wielders would target the horse's front legs. A solid strike to the foreleg could completely disable a horse, bringing both mount and rider crashing down. The momentum of the charge would work against the cavalry. Horses couldn't stop quickly enough to avoid the strikes, and the compression of the charge meant that one falling horse could bring down multiple others. Imagine the scene: a thundering cavalry charge, dozens or hundreds of horses bearing down on defensive positions. Then, as they close, massive blades emerge from behind barriers, sweeping low in horizontal arcs. Horses scream and collapse. Riders are thrown. The charge crumbles into chaos, mounted warriors now vulnerable to infantry counterattacks. This tactic was devastatingly effective against the nomadic cavalry that repeatedly invaded Chinese territories. The Zhanmadao gave infantry a reliable answer to mounted warriors, shifting the tactical balance in ways that pure pike formations couldn't achieve. But the weapon demanded extraordinary physical capability. The Zhanmadao typically weighed between 7 and 10 pounds, comparable to or heavier than the largest Zweihänders, but with a different weight distribution that made it feel even heavier in motion. All that mass concentrated in a curved blade created tremendous resistance when swung, building the strength to make effective strikes, then making multiple strikes in rapid succession as cavalry approached, required conditioning that few soldiers possessed. Chinese military records describe specific selection criteria for Zhanmadao units. Candidates needed to demonstrate not just raw strength but explosive power, the ability to generate maximum force in a single motion. They trained with weighted replicas and by cutting through thick bamboo targets, building the specific muscles and neural patterns needed for effective strikes. The psychological demands were equally intense. Standing behind minimal cover while a cavalry charge bears down on you requires nerves of steel. Wait too long to strike and the horses are on top of you. Strike too early and you waste your attack, leaving yourself vulnerable. The timing window was measured in seconds, the margin for error almost non-existent. And there was always the risk that you'd miss, that your strike would glance off horse armor or catch bone at the wrong angle, leaving you holding a massive, unwieldy weapon with an enraged mounted warrior bearing down on you. But when it worked, the Zhanmadao was perhaps the most effective anti-cavalry weapon ever devised using muscle power alone. Historical records from the Song dynasty describe battles where Zhanmadao units broke cavalry charges that should have been overwhelming. The psychological impact on nomadic warriors was significant. Cavalry's greatest strength was mobility and shock, but against prepared Zhanmadao positions, that charge became a death trap. The weapon also served a deterrent function. Nomadic armies that learned Chinese forces deployed Zhanmadao units would modify their tactics, avoiding direct charges in favor of harassment and maneuver. This tactical adaptation, forced by a specialized weapon, may have influenced the course of conflicts between settled Chinese kingdoms and steppe peoples. But like all specialized weapons, the Zhanmadao's effectiveness came with significant limitations. Against infantry, the weapon was far less useful. Its weight and extreme curve made it slower and less precise than conventional swords. The blade's thickness meant it couldn't make the delicate cuts needed for anti-personnel combat. In close quarters, its length became a liability. A Zhanmadao wielder facing infantry would be at a significant disadvantage against opponents with shields and shorter weapons. This specialization meant Zhanmadao units required combined arms support. They needed infantry protection, archers to harass approaching cavalry, and reserves to counterattack after breaking charges. In isolation, they were vulnerable. Only when integrated into a larger defensive system did they reach their full potential. The weapon also became increasingly obsolete as military technology evolved. Improvements in horse armor reduced the Zhanmadao's effectiveness. The introduction of cavalry tactics that avoided direct charges, mounted archery, hit-and-run raids, negated its defensive advantage. And as with Europe, gunpowder weapons eventually made specialized anti-cavalry swords irrelevant. By the Ming dynasty, the Zhanmadao had largely disappeared from military use. A few units maintained the tradition, but most armies had moved on to firearms and more flexible weapon systems. The specialized knowledge of forging and using these massive blades faded, preserved only in martial arts schools and military museums. Today, authentic Zhanmadao are exceptionally rare. The weapon's specialized nature meant fewer were made compared to general-purpose swords, and fewer survived. Most existing examples are reconstructions based on historical descriptions and artwork, giving us approximations of what these fearsome blades looked like and how they might have been used. But the Zhanmadao remains unique in the history of edged weapons, a blade so extreme in its specialization, so uncompromising in its design, that it represents the absolute limit of what could be achieved with two-handed swords. It wasn't the most elegant weapon, or the most versatile, or even the most famous. But for its specific purpose, stopping cavalry charges through pure cutting power, nothing else in history came close. From the pike-breaking Zweihänder to the horse-cutting Zhanmadao, we've journeyed through 5 weapons that pushed human strength and metallurgical skill to their absolute limits. Each represents not just a tool of war, but a solution to specific tactical problems, forged in the crucible of actual combat and refined through generations of warriors who staked their lives on these massive blades. These weren't the weapons of common soldiers. They were the arms of specialists, men who dedicated years to mastering weapons that could kill with devastating efficiency but demanded incredible physical and mental conditioning. Warriors who understood that wielding such power came with enormous risk, that one mistake could be fatal, that the weapon itself was as dangerous to its user as to any enemy. And while these mighty blades have passed into history, made obsolete by gunpowder and changing tactics, their legacy endures. In every martial arts school that studies historical techniques, in every museum that preserves these engineering marvels, in every story that celebrates the warriors who wielded them, these two-handed swords remind us of a time when individual skill, courage, and strength could change the course of battles. If you enjoyed this journey through history's most formidable two-handed swords, please subscribe for more deep dives into ancient warfare and the weapons that shaped civilizations.